Hi guys, this is Andrew with Headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to be talking about the Abyss Diana Phi. This is a high-end planar magnetic over-ear open-back headphone that comes in right at around $4,000. So it's prohibitively expensive, it's a very high-end headphone, and this one has had the pads modified by YouTuber DMS. So let's take a look. So just like with my other reviews, we're going to go through the build quality, design, and comfort. We'll talk about detail, retrieval, speed, dynamics, soundstage, imaging, and timbre. We'll talk about frequency response and tonality, give a couple comparisons, and then ultimately decide whether or not this is worth it. And as usual, I've published my full written review on headphones.com, and that's where you'll be able to find the measurements for this that's been done on the Gross standardized measurement rig. So I'll leave a link in the description for that as well. Now, to begin with, when it comes to this headphone, I got to talk about a couple of things. I've actually already reviewed the Abyss Diana Phi some time ago, but as it turns out, there have been some revisions to this headphone, and that one that I reviewed wasn't representative of what people would be buying if they were buying a Diana Phi today. And so I actually took that review down because I just didn't think it would be fair for what the customer experience would be like. Of course, there were some things that I did like, but there were also a lot of things that I didn't like. Namely, I wasn't a fan of the comfort at all. I didn't like the pads that were used. I found that it pushed very strongly into your temples. That's pads like these ones here. Fast forward a few months and I got a chance to try some of the newer Abyss Diana Phis at CanJam in New York back in February, and they've since put some different pads on there. There are some black pads that they use for the V2 that they have, which is the lower end model, and those ones are quite a bit more cushiony up there, and so it doesn't press into your temples as much. Now, this headphone in particular is known as having the DMS mod, which is essentially modifications done to the pads. So who is DMS and what has he done with the pads for this headphone? DMS, of course, is a popular YouTuber who does headphone reviews. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description as well. But he has been working with Abyss now for a little bit, and one of the things that he's done is he's modified the Diana Phi just because he wanted to do that for himself. And we all got a chance to try out his modified Diana Phi at the show, and we're all really impressed. Since then, I've been really looking forward to get a chance to try out the Diana Phi in my home environment. Obviously, show conditions are not the best. You can get impressions, but that's about it. And so thankfully, a community member sent me this unit here with the DMS modded pads. Now, I do also want to note that I'm told that some of these revisions have continued for this headphone, even in the past year. Now, I'm also led to believe that these changes are very subtle at most. It should be about a 2 dB difference, but at the very least, it's important to just keep that in mind. Now, with that long caveat out of the way, let's dive right into the build quality, design, and comfort, and also what you get when you buy this headphone, because you do also get this baggie here. Normally, I would rather have it be in a hard shell case, but because Abyss has had such great construction and build quality on their headphone, I think they feel a little bit more confident that they can give you a case like this, and then you can just throw it into a backpack and you can be confident that it's not going to break. Now, when it comes to build quality and durability, I believe them. They've made a big deal about running over headphones with Jeeps. Please don't run over your headphones with a Jeep. I got a little bit sad inside when I watched that video. In any case, for the durability of these headphones, I believe them. These look and feel like they would last a long time. There are very few failure points because this is all one piece here. And of course, you get this little magnetic extension to the arm as well. And my biggest problem with the previous one that I evaluated was, of course, that with these pads, the older pads, the top part would dig into the side of my temples, and it's because there wasn't enough angle moving inwards, partially again because of the build quality that's going on here, it would really hurt after even just like 15 minutes. And so what's happened with the DMS pad mod here is that he's actually taken some of the material out of the top of the pad where it would normally press against the side of your temple. And what this does is it makes it fit my head perfectly. I have no problem getting through a full day of wearing these, and it's to the point where I wish that this was just sort of the default pad that you get with this headphone. So this is effectively a lightweight planar magnetic headphone that is meant to compete with some of the big boys, the LCD4 and the Hi-Fi Svara and some of those other crazy, high-end nanoscale planars that have ridiculous technical performance. So speaking of which, let's talk about that next. For detail retrieval, I think the Diana Phi performs up there with some of the best out there. Now this is where this unit in particular is different from the previous one that I evaluated. This one sounds quite a bit more detailed to my ear. I think when you're considering the landscape for high-end headphones and you're looking at, detail retrieval and image clarity and, textural nuance and that kind of stuff, there's probably a number of different categories where headphones fall, and a number of different tiers. And at the very high end, you have headphones like the Hi-Fi Man Susvara, you have the Odyssey LCD4, the Final Audio D8000 Pro, and I think the Abyss Diana Phi fits into that top tier category. But I still think it's closer to the bottom of that category than the top of that category. And let me explain that a little bit. For the mid-range detail, I think that the Abyss Diana Phi here is right up there with the very best of them. I think this competes with the LCD4 in that regard. But for the bass, I don't think it's on par with the LCD4 for detail retrieval. And for the treble, I don't think it's on par with the Hi-Fi Man Susvara, for example, or the D8000 Pro for detail retrieval. So it trades blows, and in the mid-range, I think it competes with the top dogs, but for its other aspects, I think it's maybe just one small step down, one small step behind. Still though, it's wildly impressive that they were able to do this in a form factor that's this size. It's remarkable. Now let's talk about speed and dynamics, and this is again very, very fast. The initial leading edge is extremely tight and snappy, well controlled throughout the entirety of the frequency range. The bass is so unbelievably tight, it's fantastic. And then for the dynamics, for a planar magnetic headphone, this also has pretty darn good dynamics. Now, I wouldn't say it's on the level of some dynamic driver headphones like the ZMF Verite or even the Focal Utopia, although the Focal Utopia's bass is a little bit rolled off there in comparison. But that sense of physicality and the punch that comes along with headphones, I think for a planar magnetic headphone, this is very good. It's certainly a lot better than many of those more egg-shaped Hi-Fi Man headphones out there like the HE1000 SE. For soundstage and imaging, that's where I think the Abyss Diana Phi falls flat a little bit. The lateral definition is decent, and the forward definition and the forward presence is also good, but if I could describe the stage a little bit, it would be almost like a triangle in front of me, so that the front left and front right is it doesn't have as much depth presence there for front left and front right. And also the crossover when something pans from left to right is very immediate, it's very quick. Rather than having it be a more gradual presentation across the front of the stage, which is what I kind of look for with soundstage. Now, with that said, the instrument separation is fantastic, as one would expect with a high-end planar magnetic headphone. So it's no slouch there whatsoever, and I don't think anybody who's using this just exclusively for music is going to be all that bothered by the stage of it. Maybe if you guys are using this for gaming and you're trying to 360 no-scope people, you might have a little bit of a harder time there, but I can't imagine that's the primary use case for these headphones. Although I know there's a few of you guys out there. I see you. When it comes to timbre, I actually find that for the material-related timbre, the Diana Phi is pretty darn good, actually. Again, for a planar magnetic headphone, it doesn't have that sort of dryness quality that I sometimes worry about, and so it actually has a reasonable amount of, natural tone there to it. But I think it really stumbles when it comes to frequency response-related timbre. We'll talk about frequency response next. Now, like I mentioned early on in this review, I have measured this on the Gross 43AG standardized measurement rig, and those measurements will be up there on headphones.com. As it turns out, with the Diana Phi, it changes so dramatically depending on the positioning that you have on your head. So the frequency response itself will change depending on if you're wearing it forward or backward. If you're listening to it with it all the way back like this, you're going to get a completely different presentation from if you're listening to it with it all the way forward like this. And so, I've done my best to measure this with the different positions that it has, so you might get a sense of that. And for me, I do find that my favorite position for this headphone is right in the middle. Don't read too much into that. That general curve there is what I think I get most commonly with this headphone. But with that said, I do think this is one that does require a little bit of EQ. And in one particular spot, but we'll get there. Let's start with the bass. The bass on the Diana Phi, I think, is pretty good. It doesn't have as much sub-bass presence there, but where most of the information is, at around like 70 hertz and up, it's got lots of presence there, and it follows the Harman shelf a little bit, not quite to the full degree of the 2013 Harman bass shelf, but it's still quite well extended there. Moving up into the mid-range, there's no bleed into the different ranges, which is really nice. And then when you get to around like 1.5k hertz, there's a little bit of an elevation here that causes a somewhat congested kind of sound to it, which isn't great, but it's also not that substantial either. It's just by a few dB there. So if anybody's worried about mids and mid forwardness and that sort of congested kind of sound that can happen from it, there's a little bit of it on this headphone, but it's not too bad. When you go up into the upper mid-range though, that's when things start to get a little bit weird. And I say weird because this actually has a fairly agreeable elevation there at the primary ear resonance. So, you know, at around 2k hertz, it elevates appropriately like it should. But the problem is that right at around 3k hertz, there's a bit of a bump there that's a little bit too emphasized over the ranges on either side of it, meaning that 2.5k hertz and 4k hertz are a little bit subdued there. Once again, if you then move this back and forward, you may find that that shows up in a different spot. But there is this sort of somewhat disjointed and convoluted sound to the upper mid-range that the effect is essentially, if you're listening to classical music and you're listening to anything with orchestral swells, you'll find that you don't get that same sense of fullness that you do from something like a, you know, Hi-Fi Man aria, for example, that's a little bit more filled in those ranges. But overall, you know, the general trend here for the frequency response is pretty good. It leans slightly warm because when you get into the lower treble, it's a little bit more subdued there. But then the problem that shows up with this headphone, the only really substantial problem for the frequency response for the DMS modded Diana Phi, is that there's a very strong resonance there at around 10k hertz. Now, it doesn't look all that extreme on the graph because it looks like it gets close to the target. But the problem is that right there, it shouldn't actually get close to the target. And this is something that I've talked about in the past, but essentially that's where you're supposed to have a little bit of interaction there with one of the components of your ear, one of the pieces of your ear, and this is supposed to show a dip. There's a lot that goes into this, but essentially good headphones should measure with a bit of a dip there between 9 and 10k hertz, and it varies depending on the headphone. And if you look at the measurements of, you know, any other headphone that you think has great treble, there's always going to be a dip there, almost always going to be a bit of a dip there. And with the Diana Phi, it's not. It's elevated there. And so you kind of get like, not only is there not a dip, but it's also elevated. So it's kind of like twice the peak. And what this peak does is it causes this odd kind of shimmering quality. It makes it so that the tonal character of your cymbal hits are, you know, overshadowed by this shimmering character that gets imparted to pretty much the entirety of the mix. You can even hear it in the background for certain vocals that come through. It's the sort of odd shimmering character that I think is responsible for the somewhat more unnatural sound to this headphone. And so that's the first problem with the treble here. And then above that, it's okay. It's a little bit emphasized in the air regions there around like 12k hertz. But above that, around 14, 15, 16k hertz, when we start to kind of push the limits of, you know, human hearing, there is a massive resonance on this headphone. It's like way up there. And I think whether or not you're going to be bothered by this is going to have more to do with age or, you know, where the point where your hearing rolls off, because, you know, our hearing tends to roll off as we get older, and it starts to roll off around, you know, those frequencies like 16, 17k hertz. And for me, it's not that bad, but I do hear it on the edge of certain tones. And when it comes through, again, I hear it most strongly and most commonly on cymbal hits, it kind of, emphasizes the unnaturalness of those cymbal hits. Now, because of this is why I recommend EQing this headphone. And really, you don't have to do much. You just have to add a fairly narrow peak filter there at around 10k hertz. And then you got to drop it by like 6.5 dB. And when I say narrow, I mean use a Q value of something like 5 or 6, and see how that goes, because that is probably the most important thing to do for this. That's the most important thing to change. The rest of it is all optional, I think. You may want to fix a few things here and there in the mids, but for the most part, it's just that one resonance that comes through at around 10k that's actually bothersome. Now, I'm not talking like on the level of like the DT1990 Pro, because this isn't sibilant. This is actually really smooth in the consonant range. Your S's and F's and T's, there's no problems with that. It's just this shimmering character that kind of permeates everything in the mix that, you know, as soon as I got rid of it, I was like, oh, it's wonderful. Now, let's give a couple comparisons. I'd said earlier that I think, you know, for technical ability, this fits in the highest tier there, the top category there, and competes with, you know, the LCD4 from Odyssey, the Final Audio D8000 Pro, HE1000 SE from Hi-Fi Man, and the Susvara as well. And I think, again, that compared to the HE1000 SE, that's the closest I would put for detail for this headphone. I don't think that this is on the level of the Hi-Fi Man Susvara. I think it's probably closer to somewhere in between, you know, the HE1000 SE, the Final Audio D8000 Pro, and the LCD4. I think those three and the mid-range here are pretty darn close. And then once again, for bass and treble, I think, you know, all of those different headphones have a different strength and weakness. Again, LCD4, if you want bass detail, LCD4 all the way. That's probably the best that I can think of for that. But it's so impressive that the Abyss Diana Phi here is able to keep up with and compete at that crazy detail level, with the form factor and comfort that it has. And because of that, I really think that this is a solid alternative to the Hi-Fi Man Susvara, because if you think about headphones that you're able to actually wear for a long period of time and you're not, having to deal with crazy weight issues like from the LCD4 or the comfort issues of, the Final Audio D8000, there's really not that many options out there. And this, I think, is one of them. Now, with that said, my money would still go towards the Hi-Fi Man Susvara. I think that's the one that compromises even less because it nails the frequency response as well. Whereas with the DMS Diana Phi, it does so many other things really, really well. But I think there's a few issues there and resonances with the frequency response that could be improved on a little bit. And with the Susvara, it's an extra $2,000, but I think that extra $2,000 is worth it because you also gain, I think, a little bit better detail there as well. Now, let's give a conclusion here. Do I recommend the Abyss Diana Phi with the DMS mod? Well, again, I think if you are comfortable doing EQ, absolutely I recommend this because it does something that no other headphone does. It does lightweight, good build quality, and unparalleled comfort for a long period of time with the technicalities that these other high-end flagship planar magnetic headphones have. Now, if you're not comfortable doing any kind of EQ, I do have a recommendation for you, or maybe you already own one of these and you're wondering how do I get rid of this resonance issue that you're talking about. If you run this off of a warmer source, maybe you have a tube amplifier of some kind, run it off of something that's going to curb this 10 kHz resonance issue, and that may actually make it a little bit more agreeable to listen to. The one thing that I will say though is that this does require quite a bit of power to drive. So I've been running it off of the Kaina HA6 from the balanced output there, which has 7 watts a channel, so it's a very powerful amplifier. I've also been running it off of the SPL Fondator X and a number of other amplifiers, but my favorite was the Kaina HA6 for this headphone. While yes, you can run it off of lower end sources or more portable sources, I think if you want to get the most out of it, you should probably run it off of like a desktop system. Anyways, that does it for this video. If you guys like what I'm doing here, consider subscribing, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.